She woke before the sun did, not because she wanted to, not because some quiet part of her enjoyed the stillness of those early hours. She woke because if she didn't, Auntie Brenda would find a reason to make the entire day worse than it needed to be. Ella's feet hit the cold concrete floor before the first bird outside had even decided to sing. No slippers. She'd learned not to ask for those. The last time she asked for something, she was reminded, loudly and in front of the neighbors, that she was not a guest in that house. She was a burden, and burdens, apparently, did not deserve slippers. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Thank you. Now back, she moved through the compound in the half-dark, broom in hand, sweeping dust that would settle again by noon. Her feet knew every uneven stone, every crack in the ground. She had memorized this place the way you memorize a prison, not because you love it, but because you have no choice but to know it. By the time the sky turned gray, she was already in the kitchen. Auntie Brenda appeared at exactly 6:45, as she always did, still in her wrapper, hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, face carrying the specific kind of displeasure that had nothing to do with anything Ella had done, and everything to do with who Ella was, or rather, who Auntie Brenda needed her to be. The insult started before the tea finished boiling. Ella had noticed this pattern long ago. It was almost clockwork. No good morning, no acknowledgement, just criticism, delivered like a daily weather report. Consistent, unremarkable, and somehow always cold. She stirred the pot and said nothing. She had learned that silence was the only armor that didn't make things worse. She cooked a full pot of soup that morning, fried plantain, boiled yam, enough for a family of 6. Then she stepped back from the stove, covered every pot, and ate nothing. That was the rule. She fed everyone in that house and fed herself last, which usually meant not at all. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the calluses on her feet and the careful blankness she wore like a second skin, something in Ella refused to disappear entirely, a small, stubborn part of her that hadn't yet learned to stop wanting. She used to think about it sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks. Somewhere in the world, she imagined, there were men who spoke softly instead of shouting. Men who looked at women like they actually mattered. Not like furniture, not like inconveniences wearing human faces. She didn't know what that felt like, but she hadn't stopped wondering. The letter was not hidden well enough. Ella found it tucked beneath the loose board at the back of the wardrobe. The one Auntie Brenda had never bothered to fix, because she never bothered to fix anything that wasn't visible to visitors. A small envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with the kind of careful fold that meant someone had pressed it closed with love. Her mother's handwriting was on the front, just one word, Ella. Her hands were shaking before she even opened it. The words inside were short, 3 paragraphs, but they were the most she had ever received from a woman she could barely remember. A woman who existed now only in one small photograph and in the ache that lived permanently behind Ella's sternum. Her mother had written about a life she had hoped for her, about a name she had chosen deliberately, about love that was not conditional on performance or obedience or silence. She was still reading when the door opened. Auntie Brenda did not ask what it was. She crossed the room in 4 steps, snatched the letter from Ella's hands, and read it standing up. Her expression did not change. That was the most frightening thing. There was no anger on her face, no guilt, no flicker of anything human. She simply folded the letter once and tore it in half, then again, The pieces fell to the floor like confetti at a celebration nobody was having. Ella did not move. Something happened in her chest in that moment. Something that had been soft for a very long time went completely, permanently hard. Not from hatred, not even from shock, but from the specific kind of clarity that only arrives when the last possible illusion has been destroyed. She finally understood. This woman was never going to change. This house was never going to become a home. And waiting for either of those things was a slow way to vanish entirely. By evening, Auntie Brenda had said the words she had probably wanted to say for years. Get out. Tonight. Take your things and don't come back. Ella listened to every word. Then she went to her room, took the photograph of her mother from beneath her pillow. The one thing they hadn't found. The one thing they hadn't touched, and placed it carefully inside her bag. She did not beg. She had made that decision before she even finished packing. If she cried, Auntie Brenda would think she had won, and Ella refused. With every quiet, exhausted, unbreakable part of herself, to give her that. So she lifted her bag, held her mother's picture a little tighter, and walked out of that house before her knees could betray her. The night outside was wet. A slow rain had started without announcement, the kind that soaks through before you realize it's serious. The road was mostly empty. A single streetlight at the corner threw a pale, watery circle on the ground. Ella stood in it for a moment, bag on her shoulder, nowhere to go, no one to call. The hunger was already there. It had been there since morning. She started walking. She did not look back, not once, because looking back was for people who had left something worth mourning behind. And everything worth mourning, her mother, her childhood, the love this house had never once offered. She was already carrying it all inside her chest. The rain came down harder, and Ella walked into it like someone who had already survived the worst thing, even if the worst thing was not yet finished with her. Nobody came to that bus stop at that hour. That was the thing about being truly alone. The world did not pause to acknowledge it. The rain had slowed to a thin, persistent drizzle, the kind that does not commit to stopping. Ella sat on the wet concrete edge of the bus stop bench, bag pressed between her feet, arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but because it was the closest thing to comfort available. The streetlight above her flickered, once, twice, then held. She had been sitting there for 40 minutes with nowhere to go and nothing but her mother's photograph in 1,200 naira in her pocket. She was not crying. She had decided that already. Then the car arrived. It did not announce itself loudly. That was the first thing she noticed. How quiet it was for something so large. A black SUV, the kind with tinted windows so dark they looked like they were keeping secrets on purpose. It rolled to a stop at the curb slowly, unhurried, the way things move when they have never once needed to rush. The engine idled for a moment, then went silent. The door opened. He stepped out without looking around first. Another thing she noticed. Most people step into an unfamiliar street and scan it. He didn't. He moved like a man who had long ago stopped worrying about what a room contained, because every room adjusted to him rather than the other way around. He was tall, not in a way that felt accidental, in a way that felt constructed. Like everything about him had been arranged deliberately. Dark coat, no tie, a watch on his left wrist that caught the streetlight for just a second. And in that second, told Ella everything she needed to know about the distance between his world and hers. He looked at her, not the quick, dismissive glance strangers gave a girl sitting alone in the rain. He actually looked, the kind of look that takes inventory, that registers trembling hands and a lifted chin, and a girl who is very clearly not okay, but is working extremely hard to appear otherwise. Ella stared straight ahead. She felt his gaze the way you feel a change in temperature. Not uncomfortable exactly, just impossible to ignore. He walked toward her with that same unhurried ease, hands in his coat pockets, and stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to not be threatening. That precision felt deliberate, too. "There are no buses at this hour," he said. His voice was low, controlled in the way that suggested it was always controlled. Not because he was suppressing something, but because he simply never needed to raise it. People leaned in when men spoke like that. The world got quieter around them without being asked. Ella did not look up immediately. "I know," she said, a beat of silence. "Can I help you get somewhere?" And there it was. She finally looked at him, really looked, at the watch, the coat, the car idling behind him like a waiting animal, at the face that was patient in a way money sometimes teaches people to be, and dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with money at all. "I don't get into cars with strangers," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "Are you always this suspicious?" "Only," she said evenly, "when strangers arrive in cars worth more than entire neighborhoods." He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. That was when she felt it, something she could not name and was not ready to examine. His eyes stayed on her, like he was trying to solve something she had not said aloud. Like her face was a question he had not expected to find interesting, and now could not quite put down. "Fair enough," he said quietly. He did not leave. He did not push. He simply stood there in the drizzle in his expensive coat, unbothered by the rain, watching her with a patience that felt less like politeness and more like a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for her to catch up. It happened fast. One moment the old woman was walking, slowly, carefully, the way people walk when their body has started to argue with their ambitions. The next moment she was falling. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, with a sharp cry and outstretched arms. She simply folded, quietly and completely, the way a candle goes out, and she was on the ground before anyone standing close enough to catch her had processed what was happening. The crowd did what crowds do. They stopped. They looked. Someone said, "Oh," and someone else said, "Is she okay?" And 3 people reached for their phones. Not to call anyone, just to hold something while they decided whether this was their problem or someone else's. Ella was already moving. She had been across the street, outside a small pharmacy, trying to calculate whether she could afford rehydration salts and still eat before nightfall. She saw the woman go down, and she crossed that road without thinking. Bag still on her shoulder, exhaustion still in every bone, because some instincts do not wait for permission. She reached her before any of the 20 people standing within arm's reach had taken a single step forward. She knelt on the concrete, one hand moving to the woman's wrist to find her pulse, the other pressing gently to her cheek. Not panicked, not performing for the audience that had gathered now that someone else had taken responsibility. "Can you hear me?" she said, close and calm. "I'm right here. Don't try to move." The woman's eyes were open, confused, frightened in the particular way of someone who cannot immediately account for how they ended up on the ground. "Someone call an ambulance," Ella said over her shoulder. Not a request, quiet, but with the kind of edge that makes people move. Someone moved. She stayed low, kept her voice steady, kept one hand on the woman's arm the entire time. Not because it was medically necessary, but because there is a specific terror in waking up on the ground surrounded by strangers, and a warm hand on your arm is the fastest way to tell someone that they are not alone in it. She did not notice the car until the ambulance was already being called. The same black SUV, parked at an angle, like it had stopped in a hurry for the first time. He was out of the vehicle before the engine had properly settled, moving through the gathered crowd with a controlled urgency that parted people without him having to ask. She felt the shift in the atmosphere before she saw him. That same drop in temperature, that same pull of attention. He reached the edge of the small space she had made around the woman and stopped. His face, for the first time, was not composed. Something moved across it, a flash of something raw and unguarded that was gone almost before it registered. He looked at the woman on the ground, then at Ella kneeling beside her, and the expression that settled on his face afterward was not one she had a name for yet. He came down to one knee on the other side. "She's breathing," Ella said immediately, because he looked like a man who needed to know that first. "Pulse is steady. She didn't hit her head. I think it's her heart, possibly a pressure drop. She needs fluids, and she needs the hospital." He nodded once. Then he looked at her, really looked, the same way he had at the bus stop. Except this time, there was something additional in it, something that was not just study. The ambulance arrived within minutes. As the paramedics took over, he stood and turned to Ella. The crowd was beginning to disperse. The crisis was resolving. Everything was loud and procedural and efficient around them. But he lowered his voice for her specifically. "Did anyone touch you?" he asked. "Before anything else. Before thank you, or who are you, or how did you know what to do. Before every other logical question a man in his position should have asked first. Did anyone touch you?" Ella blinked. "No," she said. "I'm fine." He looked at her a moment longer, like he was verifying that answer independently, and then reached into his coat. "Let me compensate you for—" "No." The word came out before she had finished deciding to say it. Clean and quiet and absolute. He paused, his hand still inside his coat. No one refused Nathan Kingsley. She would learn that later. She would learn that in the circles he moved through, his offers were not really offers. They were formalities before acceptance. People took what he extended and felt grateful for being asked. But Ella was hungry and cold, and had not slept in a proper bed in 2 days. And apparently none of that had been enough to weaken whatever stubborn, unbreakable thing lived at the center of her. He withdrew his hand slowly. That almost smile appeared again at the corner of his mouth, except this time it reached slightly further than before. "You were very calm," he said. "Back there." She needed calm, Ella said simply. Panic wouldn't have helped her. He looked at her the way he had at the bus stop, like she was a question he had not expected and could not yet put down. Except now the question had gotten more complicated, and he appeared, for perhaps the first time in a very long while, to be genuinely interested in the answer. The gates opened like they had been expecting her, which was strange, because Ella had not been expecting any of this. She sat in the back of the SUV with her bag on her lap and her hands folded carefully on top of it, watching through the window as the world outside changed. The noise of the city thinned first. Then the buildings grew wider apart. Then the road became smoother, noticeably, almost insultingly smoother, like even the ground here had been asked to behave differently. And then the house appeared. She had seen large buildings before. She had cleaned them for other people, scrubbed their floors, and wiped their windows, and made their spaces presentable without ever being invited to sit inside them. But this was not a large building. This was an argument, a quiet, architectural argument about how much distance money could place between itself and ordinary life. The gates alone were taller than the entire front of Auntie Brenda's compound. A staff member opened the car door before Ella had worked out how to open it herself. She stepped out onto a driveway, so clean, it seemed almost rude to walk on it. The air was different here, cooler, quieter, carrying the faint scent of something expensive she could not identify. Her bag felt smaller suddenly. She felt smaller. She followed where she was led. Inside, the floors were polished to a mirror finish. Ella's first mistake was stepping onto one without slowing down. Her worn rubber sole nearly skated from under her, and she caught herself on nothing. Pure, embarrassing instinct, and stood very still afterward, composing her face back into something dignified, while her heart rate made its own private recovery. Nobody mentioned it, but Nathan, standing at the far end of the entrance hall with his phone in his hand, looked up at exactly the wrong moment. Or the right one, depending on who was telling the story. He said nothing, but he moved, without announcement, and placed himself slightly closer to her for the remainder of the walk through. Near enough that if her feet betrayed her again, there was something solid within reach. She did not acknowledge this. Neither did he. The dining room was the second problem. There were chairs on both sides of the table, and she chose the wrong one. She understood this the moment a staff member paused, tray in hand, with the specific frozen expression of someone deciding whether to correct a guest. Ella stood immediately. "Sorry," she said. Then, because she had not yet learned to stop, "I'm sorry. Should I?" She was already moving to another chair when Nathan appeared at the doorway. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," he said, quietly. No performance in it. She sat, then apologized once more, softly, for no clear reason. He watched her do this. She would notice later that he watched her in the way someone watches a pattern they are beginning to understand. Not intrusively, just with a kind of careful, private attention. He moved her chair in by exactly 1 inch when he passed behind her. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to be done. When the tea arrived, he reached for the tray at the same moment she did. His fingers crossed hers for less than a second. He pulled back. She pulled back. The tray stayed where it was, briefly unclaimed, while something passed between them that neither of them was prepared to name. That touch should not have felt like anything. It was accidental. A fraction of a second against a cold metal tray. But it landed somewhere in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple moved outward long after his hand was gone. She reached for the small spoon. The wrong one, it turned out. There were 3. Nobody had explained the 3 spoons. She looked at them with the expression of someone who has walked into a test they did not know was scheduled, and selected the middle one on principle. Nathan watched her, and, for the first time since she had entered his world, she saw something genuine break across his face. Not the almost smile, not the controlled amusement, but something real and brief and warm that disappeared before she could be certain she had seen it at all. From the kitchen doorway, one of the staff members watched him watch her. Her expression said everything he had not yet said aloud. Auntie Brenda arrived with soft eyes. That was the first wrong thing. Ella had known this woman for 19 years. She had studied her moods the way you study weather in a place prone to storms. Not out of interest, but out of survival. She knew the tight mouth that meant silence was safest. She knew the particular stillness before a cutting remark landed. She knew every variation of Auntie Brenda's displeasure, the way a sailor knows the sea that has almost drowned him repeatedly. She did not know this version. Soft eyes, a careful smile, hands that reached out to touch Ella's face in the entrance hall, like they had always done that. Like tenderness between them was something with history behind it. "My darling," she said, out loud, in front of staff. Ella stood completely still and let herself be touched and said nothing, because she understood immediately. This performance was not for her. It was for Nathan. He was at the top of the staircase when Auntie Brenda arrived, and Ella felt the exact moment he appeared without turning around. That shift in the room's atmosphere. That quiet redistribution of attention. Auntie Brenda had felt it too. The smile widened. The hands on Ella's face pressed a little more deliberately. A woman painting a portrait, she needed a specific person to believe. Ella stepped back gently and folded her hands in front of her. The necklace appeared the next morning. A staff member found it during routine tidying. Inside Ella's bag, wrapped in the small cloth pouch that belonged to Mrs. Kingsley's dressing table. The kind of discovery that happens too cleanly, too conveniently, found by the right person, in the right place, at the right time, with the right witness standing just close enough to react visibly. Ella heard about it from the doorway of the sitting room, standing with her bag already packed, because the moment she understood what was happening, some deep and exhausted part of her had simply reached for the most familiar response she knew, leaving before she was pushed. The room was not loud. That made it worse, somehow. Accusation delivered quietly, in a carpeted room with good lighting, still lands the same way. She stood in the center of it. Auntie Brenda's expression now carefully rearranged into something wounded, the staff member hovering, the pouch sitting on the table like evidence at a trial she had not been informed was scheduled, and she did not defend herself. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned, across 19 years of being disbelieved in that woman's house, that innocence is not always a sufficient argument. Nathan walked in during the silence. He read the room in approximately 4 seconds. His eyes moved from the pouch on the table to Auntie Brenda's performance, to the staff member's posture, and finally to Ella, standing straight, chin level, bag strap in her hand, wearing the particular expression of someone absorbing pain they have decided not to show. Something in his jaw shifted. "No one searches her room again," he said, "without my permission." Not loud, not heated, delivered with the flat, total certainty of a man issuing a boundary that was not open to discussion. Auntie Brenda began to speak, and he did not look at her when he said, "We're done with this now." The room emptied with the specific efficiency of people who understood the conversation was over. Ella was already moving toward the door when his voice reached her. "Where are you going?" "I think it's better if I—" "That's not what I asked." She stopped, turned. He was closer than she had realized, standing in the middle of the room, with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes on her, with that same focused, unreadable patience. "You think walking away solves everything," he said. "It solves," she said carefully, "being somewhere I'm not wanted." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense, with something that had been building since a bus stop in the rain, since fingers crossing over a tea tray, since a man who could have ignored her had chosen, repeatedly, not to. "Who told you," he said quietly, "that you are not wanted here?" She had no answer for that, and he did not move. He simply stood there and waited, the way he always waited, like her answer was the only thing in the room that mattered, and he had nowhere else to be. They took her on a Tuesday, an ordinary morning, gray sky, light traffic, the kind of unremarkable day that has no business being the setting for the worst thing that has happened to you. Ella had stepped out to the pharmacy 2 streets from the mansion. A simple errand, 15 minutes at most. The kind of task so small, nobody thinks to worry about it until something goes wrong. The car came from behind. No warning, no escalation. Just a vehicle pulling alongside her on a quiet stretch of road. A door opening before it had fully stopped. And hands, more than one pair, that did not ask. She fought, not strategically, not with any training or plan. She fought the way cornered things fight. With everything, immediately, without calculating odds. Her bag went first, then her elbow, then her voice. Sharp and loud in the empty street, before something pressed against her and the world folded at the edges and went dark. She woke in a room she did not recognize. Concrete walls, a single bulb, the smell of somewhere that had not been cleaned in a long time. Her wrists were not bound, but the door was locked, and the man standing against the far wall had the specific stillness of someone paid to stay in one place and ask no questions. She did not know how long she was there. Time moves strangely in a locked room. It either crawls or disappears entirely, and there is no way to tell which until it is over. What she heard first, before anything else, was his voice, not shouting. That was what stopped her breathing for a moment. Nathan Kingsley was on the other side of that door, and he was not shouting. He was speaking in that low, controlled register she had come to recognize, except stripped now of every layer of composure until only the core of it remained. Something cold, something absolute. "Touch her again," he said, "and whatever problem you have with my family becomes your smallest problem." A beat of silence. Then the door opened. He came through it, like a man who had already decided exactly what would happen if she was not standing on the other side. And the relief that crossed his face when he saw her, raw and unguarded and gone in less than a second, was the most honest thing she had ever seen on him. He crossed the room in 4 steps. "Are you hurt?" His hands were on her face. Before the question finished, tilting her chin carefully toward the light, reading her the way you read something you cannot afford to misread. His eyes moved, her forehead, her jaw, her wrists, systematic and fast, and searching for something he was clearly dreading finding. "I'm okay," she said. He looked at her like that was insufficient information. "Ella, I'm okay," she said again, and her voice broke slightly on the second word, not from fear, but from the specific exhaustion of having held herself together in that room for however many hours it had been, and now having someone in front of her that made holding together feel suddenly optional. Her knees decided then, not dramatically, just a slow, quiet withdrawal of cooperation, the body finally presenting its bill for everything the mind had been refusing to acknowledge. She felt herself going, and there was nothing to grab, and then there was his arm, already there, already moving before she had finished falling, wrapping around her back with the kind of certainty that does not think about itself. He pulled her in and held her upright, and she pressed her face against his chest and just stopped calculating, stopped composing her expression, stopped performing fine. His hand was at her back, firm, steady. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, faster than his face was admitting. She could feel the tension in his arm, a controlled, barely contained trembling that told her everything his voice had not said, that he had driven here at a speed that had nothing to do with professional obligation, that the composure was assembled, not natural, that something in him had been genuinely afraid of what he might find. For the first time in years, in more years than she could honestly count, someone was holding her like losing her would cost them something. Not out of duty, not out of transaction, not because she had been useful or obedient or small enough to be convenient, just because she was her, and she stood in that destroyed, concrete room, in arms she had not asked for and did not want to leave, and understood that something had shifted between them that neither of them would be able to pretend had not happened. He did not let go first. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive loudly. It came the way most important things come, quietly, in a room that had not been prepared for it, while everyone was still pretending the previous version of events was intact. Mrs. Kingsley had been recovering for 3 weeks when she asked to see the photograph. Ella had not mentioned it to anyone. She carried it the way she carried everything important, privately, close to her body, protected from the world, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had learned early that the things you love openly are the first things taken from you. But Mrs. Kingsley had seen it once, briefly, on the bedside table, and something in the older woman's face had shifted in a way that Ella had noticed and filed away and not known what to do with. She handed it over without asking why. Mrs. Kingsley held it in both hands, looked at it for a long time, long enough that the silence in the room changed quality, thickened, became weighted, became the kind of quiet that precedes something irreversible. "Lydia," she said finally, softly, like a name she had not spoken in a long time, and was testing whether it still fit in her mouth. Ella went very still. What unfolded in that room over the next hour rearranged everything. Her mother, quiet, careful, Lydia, who had died when Ella was 4, and existed now only in a photograph and a torn letter and a permanent ache, had not been a stranger to this family. She had been close to it, protected by it, once, promised safety by Nathan's father during a period of danger that the Kingsley family had not handled cleanly. She had been let down in a way that could not be undone, and she had raised Ella alone afterward, and then she had died, and Auntie Brenda, who had known all of it, every piece, had taken Ella in not from grief or duty or love, but from a quiet, calculated arrangement that had benefited no one but herself. Every year of silence, every insult, every locked pot and cold floor and torn letter. Not ignorance, choice. When Nathan was told, he stood at the window with his back to the room for a long time. When he turned around, his face was the stillest she had ever seen it. Auntie Brenda was asked to leave the property that afternoon. There was no theater in it, no shouting, just a conversation conducted at a volume that left no room for argument, and a car that arrived and departed, and a door that closed on 19 years of damage with very little ceremony. Clara followed. The necklace was found in the place it had actually come from. The answer so obvious, once someone looked without assuming, that the investigation took less than a morning. Ella stood in the garden that evening, not knowing what to do with her hands. The garden was the most honest place in the mansion. Less arranged than the interior, the night air moving through it without permission, the darkness genuine rather than decorative. She had come out here to think, and found instead that thinking required a quieter mind than she currently possessed. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. He always moved too quietly for that. She heard the change in the air, that particular shift that she had stopped pretending she did not notice. Nathan came to stand beside her, not facing her, both of them looking out at the same dark garden, the same, indifferent sky. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was choosing his words with more care than usual. "You walked into my life," he said finally, "looking like you needed saving." She waited, somewhere between the bus stop and everything after. "You became the person I could not stop thinking about." A pause. "I don't know exactly when it happened. I only know that it did, and that I stopped trying to argue with it some time ago." Ella looked at him for a moment, at the profile of a man who had everything the world recognized as mattering, and who was standing in a dark garden, being genuinely careful with her. "I need you to understand something," she said. He turned. "I am not interested in being rescued," she said. "Not by anyone, only respected. That is all I have ever asked for. That is all I ask now." Something in his expression settled. Not surprised, not diminished, but arrived, like a man who had been walking toward a specific place and had finally recognized it. "Then, I will spend the rest of my life," he said quietly, "proving I know the difference." He reached for her hand, not urgently, not with the performance of a grand gesture. He simply closed his hand around hers, the way you hold something you have been careful with for a long time. Firmly enough that it knows it is held, gently enough that it remains free. Then he pressed his lips to her forehead and stayed there for a moment, in the quiet, in the dark, in a garden that smelled like night-blooming things, in the particular freedom of a chapter that is finally, completely closed. She had come into this house carrying one small bag and 19 years of survival, and a photograph of a woman who had loved her before the world had the chance to teach her that love was conditional. She had come in uncertain, apologizing for wrong chairs and wrong spoons, bracing for the cruelty that had always, eventually arrived. It had not arrived. Something else had. She left her past in that house. Not the memories, not the mother she carried always, but the weight of it, the waiting for pain, the reflex that flinched before anything had happened. This time, she did not leave alone, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, the future felt less like something to survive, and more like something that was actually, genuinely, hers